The evening air was heavy with the scent of dust, hay, and smoke, though at first the smoke was faint enough that no one paid attention. The wedding had been held in the barn, an old timber-framed relic that had served generations of families for gatherings, harvests, and celebrations, and tonight it had been dressed with lanterns, white ribbons, and wildflowers gathered fresh from the prairie. The bride, Evelyn, had smiled until her cheeks ached, surrounded by laughter, dancing boots, fiddles, and clinking glasses. But as the sun dipped behind the hills and the twilight settled over the land, something changed in the air. She felt at first as a shiver down her spine, a whisper of unease, and then came the faint crackle, wood snapping, a hiss that sounded almost alive. Most of the guests were outside now, scattered in small groups laughing under the stars, and she had slipped back into the barn to collect herself, to breathe, to feel the quiet. She hadn't expected to be left alone in her wedding dress, with only flickering lanterns for company, and when she turned toward the far corner she saw the small lick of orange flame, crawling up the haystack, glowing brighter by the second, greedy, alive. Panic shot through her veins like lightning. She rushed forward instinctively, then stopped short, realizing she couldn't put it out with her bare hands. Her breath came in fast, sharp bursts. "Help!" she shouted, her voice breaking against the wooden beams. But the fiddler's song outside was loud, the laughter of guests like a blanket covering her desperate cries. She screamed again, louder, but the fire had already leapt to the rafters, feeding on the dry wood, spitting sparks like angry wasps. Smoke began to curl downward, choking, filling her lungs until every breath burned. She staggered backward, her white dress dragging in the dust, her veil catching on a broken nail in the wall until it tore free with a sound that matched her racing heartbeat. The barn was becoming an oven, each beam above her creaking, popping, threatening to give way. She pounded on the wall, screaming until her throat went raw, tears blurring her vision, but no one came. Her legs buckled beneath her as the flames circled, trapping her in a cage of heat and smoke, her body trembling as fear closed in. She thought of her parents, her vows only just spoken, the life she'd been promised tonight, and in that terrible moment she knew she might never see the sunrise again. But then, like a miracle cutting through the chaos, she heard it. A man's voice, rough and commanding, shouting her name. "Evelyn!" It boomed through the crackling inferno like thunder. Her heart leapt even as her voice was nearly gone. "Here!" she croaked, barely audible. The barn door was wrenched with brute force, the wood groaning as it splintered under the weight of a shoulder that refused to be denied. Through the smoke and chaos, a figure emerged,
silhouetted by the firelight. His name was Cade, a ranch hand known more for his silence than his words, a man who carried the weight of the prairie in his steady gait, and now he moved like a force of nature. Without hesitation, he tore his bandana from around his neck, pressed it to her mouth to shield her from the worst of the smoke, and swept her into his arms. She was light as a feather but trembling, coughing, clinging to him with a desperation that clawed at his heart. "Hold on, darling," he said, his voice low but steady, as if the world wasn't collapsing around them. "I've got you." He moved with purpose, boots crunching against the burning debris, every step a gamble as beams groaned and fell just behind them. The flames roared louder, furious that their prey was being stolen, spitting sparks against his back, singeing the edge of his sleeve. Evelyn buried her face against his chest, trying not to look at the collapsing roof above. She could hear the groan of timbers snapping like bones, see through the smoke the way the roof sagged in the middle, ready to come down in a deadly cascade. Her breath hitched. "We won't make it," she whispered, fear clawing at her throat. But Cade only tightened his grip, his jaw set. His eyes locked on the sliver of open air ahead where the barn door hung broken. "We'll make it," he growled, a promise as fierce as the fire itself. He lowered his shoulder, shielding her from the falling ash, and surged forward. Behind them, a beam split in two, slamming into the floor where they had just been, sending sparks exploding outward. The sound was deafening, but Cade didn't falter. He carried her like she weighed nothing, his body straining with each stride but his resolve unbreakable. And then, with a final burst, they broke through the threshold, stumbling out into the night air just as the roof behind them gave way in a thunderous collapse. The barn crumbled inward, flames shooting high into the sky, sparks swirling upward like stars being torn from the heavens. A gasp went up from the wedding guests who had only now realized what had happened. They rushed forward, their faces pale with shock. But Cade lowered Evelyn gently onto the cool grass, his hand still steady against her back as she coughed, sobbed, and tried to catch her breath. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief, and in that moment, with the fire casting a hellish glow behind him, he looked less like a man and more like something carved out of legend. Unyielding, fearless, the kind of protector a soul never forgets. He tipped his hat, sweat and soot streaking his face, but his gaze was calm, steady, as if he had done nothing more than his duty. "You're safe now," he said softly. Her hand reached out, trembling, catching his sleeve before he could rise. "You saved me," she whispered, the weight of those words heavier than the barn that had nearly taken her. Around them people rushed, voices tangled in fear and relief. But for Evelyn there was only the cowboy and the miracle of being alive. The fire continued to devour what was left of the barn, but its fury no longer mattered. Cade had pulled her from the ashes before the roof fell, and in that act, a bond had been forged stronger than any vow, written not in ink or rings, but in smoke and fire and survival. And if you felt your heart race with every word of this story, if you felt the courage of a cowboy and the fear of a bride, standing at the edge of death, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that will grip your soul, make your pulse quicken, and remind you that in the darkest moments, heroes still rise, because your support is what keeps these tales alive. And there are so many more waiting just for you. The barn smoldered long into the night. The once proud beams now twisted skeletons against the dark sky, glowing embers drifting upward like fireflies fleeing the earth. And though the wedding guests lingered in shock, speaking in hushed voices, Evelyn found herself unable to move from the spot where Cade had set her down, her body trembling with aftershocks of fear, her heart thundering with the memory of smoke, filling her lungs in flames, chasing her breath. She sat with the torn edge of her gown blackened by soot, her veil gone, her bouquet somewhere in the ashes, and though the night should have been her happiest, it now felt like a lifetime had passed in a single hour. Cade stood apart from the crowd, his broad frame outlined by the red glow of dying fire, had tilted low as if to shield him from praise or questions, and his silence was louder than any cheer. For he had not come for recognition. He had come because something in his soul would never allow him to walk away when someone cried for help. Evelyn's groom Thomas was nowhere near when the barn collapsed, and though he appeared moments later, pale and disheveled, his eyes wide with disbelief at the wreckage, his shock did little to erase the truth Evelyn had lived. When the fire closed in, when the smoke clawed at her lungs, it had not been Thomas's arms that lifted her from the inferno. It had been Cade's. She could not stop replaying the feeling of his strength, the steadiness in his voice when all else crumbled, the way his eyes had locked on hers through the haze as though no flame in the world could blind him. Thomas rushed to her side, words tumbling out. Apologies and embraces, but Evelyn felt a strange hollowness in them, as though the man she had vowed herself to only hours ago had somehow become distant, almost a stranger. Cade kept his distance, his jaw tight, as if he already knew he was an intruder in a night meant for vows. Yet something flickered in his gaze when Evelyn glanced his way, something fierce and unspoken that bound her to him in silence. The preacher muttered prayers of thanks for her survival. The guests wept with relief, yet the fire seemed to have burned away more than wood, and ribbons it had scorched illusions, left truths bare. As dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the prairie in pale gold, Evelyn slipped from the circle of worried relatives and walked toward where Cade stood by the fence line, his horse restless behind him, snorting at the smell of ash. She stopped a breath away, her voice still hoarse but steady. "You saved my life," she whispered, and he tipped his hat without meeting her eyes, murmuring, "Couldn't stand by and watch you burn." There was a gravity in his words, an honesty that made her chest tighten, and for a heartbeat they stood in silence, the world small and fragile around them. She wanted to ask why he had been the one to hear her when no one else had, why he had risked his life without hesitation, but instead she only said, "Thank you," and the words felt far too small for the weight they carried. Cade nodded once, his gaze drifting toward the horizon as though he was already readying himself to ride, and something in her ached at the thought of him leaving. Behind them, Thomas called her name, his voice sharp with impatience, and Cade finally met her eyes. A storm of emotion in them, he did not speak. "You best go to him," he said quietly. And she turned, her heart splintering. Because though the world might still call Thomas her husband, her soul already knew who had truly stood beside her when death came close. That night, when the guests finally drifted away and silence reclaimed the prairie, Evelyn lay awake, staring at the rafters of her parents' home where she had sought shelter, her thoughts consumed not by vows or promises, but by smoke and fire, and the cowboy who had carried her through them. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind outside reminded her of how close she had come to never seeing another dawn, and with it came the memory of Cade's arms, strong and unyielding, his voice promising survival when she had believed all was lost. Her chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm. A war waged inside her, between the life she had chosen and the man fate had thrust into her path in flames. Somewhere across the prairie, Cade likely sat by his fire, silent as always, but she knew with a certainty that chilled and thrilled her that the bond between them was not done. Fire had forged it, smoke had sealed it, and though the barn was ash now, what it had revealed would not fade. Tomorrow would bring questions, whispers, perhaps even scandal, but none of that mattered, for in her heart she could not deny the truth. When everything collapsed, it was Cade who came, Cade who pulled her from the ashes before the roof fell, Cade whose presence still haunted her with every breath. And if you're still here, gripped by the fire, the rescue, and the unspoken bond that's only just begun, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because there are more chapters to come, more stories of courage, love, and fate, and your support ensures that these powerful tales will keep